Haha, France bad at war. It's a running joke that refuses to die. So much so that it infects quite literally every medium we have, all because of the French army collapsing in 1940. Only take a look at movies that are not even remotely linked to the Second World War, like the American We Were Soldiers, to see snidey comments on how bad the French are at war.
We wouldn't be there if they hadn't already beaten the French army.
The French army? What's that?
It's an entirely unnecessary and undeserved reputation, and one that has caused so many young Frenchmen to die, especially at places like Dien Bien Phu, a battle which saw French paratroopers willingly jumping to their guaranteed death in order to salvage, as Max Hastings put it, their father's honour. Make no mistake, the French Navy cops this reputation as well, and it's largely due to Nelson and what he managed to achieve against it, and totally wiping it from the seas every time he faced it. But this joke, this mockery of French men-at-arms, it ignores reality, and it ignores the fact that an entire generation of Frenchmen died at Verdun holding the line in what would become one of the most pivotal and deadly battles in human history. And of course it ignores the very fact that the French Navy is the only reason the United States of America exists at this point, given it halted the resupply of Cornwallis at Yorktown, and its existence forced the British out of the war. But why and how did the French Navy go from being an equal to the Royal Navy to, well, a joke? And not only a joke, but such a joke that even French Naval Command gave up on dominating the oceans in favour of the Je ne Cole in the 19th century. Well, the answer is the French. No, that's not a typo. The French destroyed the French Navy. On the eve of the French Revolution in 1789, the French Navy was one of the most formidable in Europe. It had suffered a fair bit during the 7 Years' War, and this is partially due to the fact that France, unlike Britain, had to focus on maintaining a gigantic land army alongside its navy, not having a luxury of the North Sea and the Channel. But nevertheless, it had reached a height of professionalism by the 1780s. French naval reformers had emphasised scientific training, standardised gunnery and technical education, and naval academies trained officers in mathematics, navigation and engineering. To top it all off, French ship design was widely admired, so much so that the fabled 74-gun ship of the line, the perfect line of battleship, in many ways was a French design. During the American War of Independence, this reform shone through, as the French Navy performed effectively, contributing to the decisive defeat of the British at Yorktown by controlling the Chesapeake. Despite these strengths, though, the Navy reflected the rigid social hierarchy of the Ancien regime. The officer corps was dominated by nobles, particularly in the senior ranks, and although some talented commoners rose through the technical branches or merchant marine, advancement remained heavily influenced by birth. Sailors, often recruited from coastal communities or pressed into service, lived under harsh discipline and poor conditions. This led to social tensions that would later erupt into revolution, under the pressure as the king's power faltered. The outbreak of the French Revolution fundamentally altered this relationship between the state and its military, and the Navy above all received the brunt of this. Revolutionary ideology viewed hereditary peerage and with suspicion, and increasingly equated nobility with counter-revolution. And when your Navy's officer class is entirely drawn from that now hated aristocracy, well, it's a recipe for disaster. As the revolution intensified after 1789, naval officers were subjected to growing political scrutiny, and loyalty to the nation replaced loyalty to the king as defining criterions of service. Oaths to the revolution were now required, and political clubs began to form within ports and aboard ships. Sailors and junior officers were encouraged to monitor their superiors for signs of royalist sympathies, which in many cases led to harsher officers being reported and quickly disposed of, ruining cohesion amongst the fleet. This atmosphere of mutual suspicion undermined the tradition and authority, and it eroded discipline. This occurred right at the moment the Royal Navy was doubling down on training and discipline under a new breed of officers like Nelson and Collingwood. Many naval officers didn't even get the chance to be treated with suspicion. Themselves deeply tied to the monarchy by tradition and honour, they found themselves alienated by revolutionary demands. Some would resign in protest, others would emigrate, and a number later joined counter-revolutionary forces abroad. This voluntary exodus, combined with forced removals, further hollowed out the French Navy's experienced leadership. As revolutionary politics entered the Navy, not only through ideology but also through direct action, major naval ports such as Brest, Toulon, Rochefort and Lorient became centres of radicalisation. Sailors formed committees, aligned themselves with Jacobin clubs and demanded greater rights and improved conditions. While many grievances were legitimate, the politicisation of the fleet often spiralled into chaos and led to armed engagements between revolutionary armies and sailors. All the while, the British fleet would just sit outside the harbours waiting for the French fleet to tear itself apart. In 1793, Toulon actually revolted against the Radical Convention and invited British troops into the harbour directly. Revolutionary leaders interpreted the episode as proof of naval treachery, and although many sailors and officers remained loyal to France, the event permanently associated the Navy, in particular its leadership, with counter-revolution in the revolutionary imagination. Mutinies then became increasingly common between 1790 and 93 as sailors accused officers of sabotage, hoarding supplies, or plotting treason. In some cases, officers were imprisoned or attacked by their own crews for the crime of hoarding supplies, aka provisions, for when the ships were expected to sail on long voyages. Doing their job. They were attacked for doing their job. Revolutionary authorities often sided with the sailors too, interpreting disorder as evidence of aristocratic betrayal, rather than institutional breakdown, and this dynamic reinforced the belief that the officer corps was inherently suspect, and it justified further purging. For those who studied Soviet history and the history of the Russian Revolution, this will all sound pretty familiar to you. The most intense phase of the naval purging occurred during the Reign of Terror from 1793 to 1794. As France faced invasion, civil war and economic collapse, revolutionary leaders increasingly resorted to repression to enforce unity. The beheadings will continue until morale improves. Instead of being arrested and persecuted for the crime of noble birth, naval officers were now being arrested on vague charges such as lack of civic virtue or aristocratic arrogance, or even in some cases, insufficient enthusiasm for the revolution. Revolutionary representatives on mission, think commissars, were dispatched to naval bases with sweeping powers. They dismissed officers en masse, reorganised command structures, and ordered arrests and executions. In some ports, entire chains of command were removed within weeks, and many of them were sent directly to the guillotine. Executions of naval officers were generally fewer than those of army generals though, but they still had devastating psychological impacts. See why a soldier may never see his general. Sailors often interacted with and saw their captains and flag officers on the day-to-day basis. Ships were smaller, they were more tight-knit, so removing officers was even more devastating at sea when compared to land. By 1794, a large proportion of captains and admirals who had served before the revolution were dead, imprisoned or exiled, or just simply unemployed. Their replacements were often politically reliable, but militarily inexperienced, and they were promoted rapidly through the ranks under emergency conditions. Then you compare this to the Royal Navy, which had now been led by officers who had cut their teeth in combat. It was the equivalent of a green 19-year-old recruit walking up to a 40-year-old grizzled drill sergeant. It was never going to end well. In order to fill the gaping void left by the purge of the officer class, commoners were rapidly promoted in theory based on merit, but through the nepotism of revolutionary authorities. These new officers were expected to demonstrate revolutionary zeal, attend political meetings, and enforce ideological conformity, and failure to do so could lead to denunciation at best and the guillotine at worst. This environment discouraged independent judgment, fostered risk-adverse behaviour, which further reduced the effectiveness when they actually got to sea, if they got to sea. Unlike infantry soldiers, sailors could not be quickly trained to command complex ships at a line. Because of this, the French Navy found itself crippled and unable to sortie with anywhere near enough efficiency to hold off the Royal Navy, let alone beat it. But what happens when you actually get to sea? The effects of the purge became evident in France's naval performance during the Revolutionary Wars. It slowly just gets worse to the point where it becomes a joke. While the French army achieved remarkable successes on land, the navy struggled to challenge the British dominance at sea. Poor training, weak discipline, and inexperienced leadership contributed heavily to these repeated defeats. One of the most significant consequences of the war was the inability of the French to protect its overseas colonies and trade routes. Britain, with its stable officer corps and professional naval culture, exploited this French weakness to seize colonies and enforce blockades. French fleets often remained in port, paralysed by fear of failure and political repercussions. The culture of losing to the British Navy too led to a sense of foreboding and dread within the officers who remained, with Admiral Villeneuve being a key example of this new broken culture. So traumatised and broken was he by Nelson's victory at Aboukir Bay, the Battle of the Nile, that when the Trafalgar came around he was essentially a wreck, unable to make decisions and, according to some sources, immensely depressed. In many ways it can be said that the Battle of Trafalgar was lost before the British fleet even was sighted. Villeneuve effectively had Nelson PTSD. But even if you remove Nelson from the equation, when French ships put to sea, coordination and command were frequently inadequate. Battles such as the glorious 1st of June in 1794 demonstrated both courage amongst French sailors and a systematic weakness in its leadership. While individual ships and crews would fight incredibly bravely, overall strategic cohesion was just gone. Only look at how effective the Redoutable was at Trafalgar with her trained crew and skilled commander when comparing this to others that struggled to even stay in the line of battle. Redoutable fought victory to a standstill, and probably would have taken HMS Victory had Temeraire not come across her stern. In defense of Napoleon Bonaparte, he recognized the Navy's deficiencies but struggled to overcome the legacy of the Purge, and that was a grim reality that faced Paris. You can't just bring back an officer class overnight when you have wiped it out root and stem, a lesson Moscow would learn harshly during the Second World War. Although Napoleon would attempt to restore discipline and place extra emphasis on professional training, the loss of experienced officers could not be easily reversed. Napoleon's reforms improved shipbuilding and technical education. But after over a decade of Britain's continued naval supremacy, France found itself with limited access to the seas, constraining any attempts to even train the new officer corps. No sooner did a major sortie or squadron leave port and a British fleet appeared to chase it down, burn, sink, or take it as a prize. In short, the French Navy never really recovered the level of professionalism it had achieved in the 1770s, and this is why it gained the reputation of being the Royal Navy's reserve fleet. The 2 decades of bullying at the hands of the British would finally end, though, with the end of Napoleon, and during the 19th century, France would develop the Génécole, a doctrine that would focus the fleet on smaller vessels, surrendering control of the world's oceans completely to the Royal Navy's battle fleets. This wouldn't last forever, though, and France would after a time rebuild its fleet on the back of a new, highly trained, more egalitarian officer corps. The French would go on to push the envelope with ships like the Gloire, which was really the first ironclad. Granted, it wasn't the first purpose-built ironclad, that honour goes to HMS Warrior, but Gloire was still a massive advancement in naval construction. And then of course in World War I, France would sport a fleet of 7 immensely powerful dreadnoughts and super dreadnoughts of the Breton and Colbert class. Of course the world wars would get in the way, but at the start of the Second World War, France was building ships like the Dunkirk, the Strasbourg, the Richelieu, the Jean Bart, and it was planning the Alsace. There were genuine strides in French naval construction and architecture. Flash forward to today, of course, and France once again has one of the most powerful, most competent advanced fleets in the world, centered around the nuclear-powered carrier Charles de Gaulle and immensely powerful Freme-class frigates and destroyers and such. France today has recovered, but it took over 100 years to rebuild what it lost in under a decade. Normally I would end the video here, but I would be remiss to mention that there is actually a fairly vicious argument on whether this event constitutes an actual purge or whether it was just part of normal revolutions. Now when I say a vicious argument, I mean it's about 7 guys in penguin suits making grunting sounds while sipping brandy and acting like they control the world because they've read a few history books. But the reason I bring it up is that the argument between what happened to the French Navy as being a revolutionary circumstance is an interesting one, in every sense of the word. It was self-inflicted and an unmitigated disaster. Some argue that the revolution faced genuine threats from royalist officers and foreign powers, and making these drastic measures necessary. From this perspective, the Purge was a tragic but understandable response to an existential threat to the Republic, and it was needed to happen. But others argue that the officer class wouldn't have been a threat in the first place if the radicals in Paris hadn't started executing people. Others emphasise the ideological rigidity and paranoia of revolutionary leaders who sacrificed military effectiveness for political purity. They point out that the army, while also affected by the purges, managed to adapt more successfully due to its larger size and simpler command structures. The Navy's technical complexity made it far more vulnerable to this disruption. Recent scholarship, though, tends to take a more nuanced view, and this is probably the way to go. Either way, no matter which side of the aisle you sit on, it's incredibly obvious that if it had to happen or not, the French state is the reason the French Navy started to lose. It gutted it so badly that it left it with a reputation that it still holds to this day that is entirely undeserved. Napoleon did try and choose the lesser of two evils, but by the time he came around, the barrel was out of hardtack, and really, at the end of the day, there was no saving what was coming with the Royal Navy. You can't have the band of brothers of Nelson, Collingwood, Hardy and the others, and put them up against green officers who have never really even gone to sea, let alone commanded large fleets, with barely any experience. It's just not going to end well. Like I said, green recruit versus the drill sergeant. Thank you all for watching, like, comment, and subscribe.